when I got into tuning cars, I really learned that it didn't matter if it was a rotary, but it was always the same thing, right? And you've probably seen it. Fuel pump wasn't wired correctly, or, the ignition system isn't set up. And so on a piston engine, you got a little bit of forgiveness there because you can hear a little bit of knock if you lose some fuel pressure and maybe it didn't blow the thing up. The rotary engine, you don't get that forgiveness. So if you keep it within the targets on air-fuel ratio, timing, and temperature and all that, then I think it honestly could be one of the most reliable engines.
Welcome to the HPA Tuned In podcast. I'm Andre, your host, and in this episode, we're joined by David Mazzei from Mazzei Formula. I think anyone who's followed Formula One really longs for the days of the naturally aspirated V10s. The V12s and the V8s weren't bad either, but I've definitely got a soft spot for the V10. There's nothing quite like that sound of a naturally aspirated V10 Formula One engine revving to, let's say 18,000 RPM. Well, actually, there could be one thing that's very similar, and that is David's 5-rotor turbocharged engine. And there's a lot of debate on the internet as to whether or not this thing does actually sound like a V10 Formula One engine. I'm here to say that, at least in my opinion, it absolutely does. Now, we dive into David's background, where he's actually been brought up and trained as a musician, and that might seem like a little bit removed from developing a 5-rotor turbocharged rotary engine. But there are actually some crossovers here, which David dives into in this episode, about the sort of effects on the sound waves and how you can use that knowledge to your favor to actually change the sound that your engine makes. And he's worked really hard to develop this and try and chase down that elusive V10 F1 sound. Again, I think he's done an amazing job. Rotary engines have a bit of a bad reputation, and I think somewhat unjust as well. A lot of the problems with rotary engines come down to people who don't understand how to build them. They think that they're simple, so they can chuck one together with insufficient knowledge in their back shed. And it also comes down to rotary engine tuners who have come from a piston engine tuning background and try and apply the same tuning techniques that work on a piston engine to a rotary engine. And the results are lots of needlessly broken engines. We find out from David about his own philosophy on both building and tuning an engine that's going to last the test of time. Before we jump into our chat, for those who are new to the Tuned In podcast, High Performance Academy is an online training school. We specialize in teaching people how to build performance engines, how to tune EFI, how to construct wiring harnesses. We also cover topics on fabrication, 3D modeling and CAD, race driver education, and data logging, just to name a few. You can find all of our courses at hpacademy.com/courses. All of these courses are delivered in high-definition video modules that you can watch from anywhere in the world, provided you've got an internet connection. This means you can learn from the comfort of your own place, and you can learn at your own pace. All of our courses also come with a 60-day, no questions asked, money-back guarantee. So if you purchase them for any reason at all, decide it wasn't quite what you expected, no problem, let us know. We'll give you a full refund. And for podcast listeners, you can also use the coupon code podcast75. That will get you $75 off the purchase of your very first HPA course. We'll put the coupon code in the show notes to make it nice and easy for you to find. Lastly, if you like free stuff, then I've got a great deal for you. We are constantly partnering with some of the biggest names in the aftermarket performance industry to give away some great prizes. You can always find our latest prize at hpacademy.com/giveaway. It might be an aftermarket ECU or dash. It could be some engine components or engine building tools, or just about anything in between. They are great prizes, and we will ship them free of charge to your door if you're the winner. There's no tricks here, no purchase required to get your name into the draw. All right, enough with our introduction. Let's get into our interview now. All right, welcome to the podcast, David. Thanks for joining us today. This is one that I'm definitely excited for. As always, let's start by finding out a little bit about your background and specifically how you got interested in cars.
Yes, sir. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate you inviting me to this podcast. It's one of my favorites. I love how technical you get and how educational and professional all your videos are. And it's a real treat to be here and just have the opportunity to talk with you. So thanks for having me on here.
I appreciate it.
But yeah, so my name is David Mazzei, and I was born in Virginia. And in Virginia, I lived near a naval base or a naval shipyard where they built all the nuclear submarines and aircraft carriers. And then, of course, there was Langley Air Force Base that was near there. So when I was a kid, I was exposed to all these cool things like fighter jets, and I got to go to the Space and Rocket Museum. And so when I was, 4 or 5 years old, that was my whole life. I want to be a fighter pilot. I was obsessed with airplanes and all military tech. And so I was always playing with my Legos, and I was in my own little world, just, dreaming about kind of stuff. And so,
I went down a very similar path after Top Gun, the movie. The first one came out, probably showing my age a little bit, but much like probably thousands, tens of thousands of people all around the world. But yeah, I wanted to be Maverick. That's my
yeah.
my trajectory. I'm going to be a naval fighter pilot flying an F-14 Tomcat. Although I do have my pilot's license, so I guess I got a little way towards that dream.
Do you really? That's awesome. What do you fly?
Just a little Cessna 172. I just do it for fun. Yeah, but we live in a beautiful part of the world, and scenic flights in Queenstown and the surrounds are amazing. So yeah, I really, really love flying.
Wow, that's really cool.
But I digress. Let's get back to your story.
Yeah, sure. I love it. That's awesome, man. So, way into that same stuff, just like you. I was born in '89, so I grew up in the early '90s, and my father had an appraisal company out of the house. And so he had a bunch of different computers and people that would come over and work. And so I was exposed to computers too, pretty young age then, which it wasn't common to have, computers at home. People were just now starting to get computers at that time. And, we had America Online and the dial up. And so I was, tinkering with the computer and learning MS-DOS and all that when I was, 5, 6 years old. And so I think that's a big part of this, because that allowed me to kind of get a jump on how to have access to information. And so I was able to learn real quickly by, using the internet, and specifically at those times growing up, like the forums. And then I was also into music. I played my trumpet a lot. And I just I have friends, but I always loved to just be in my own world. So it was always music and cars. And I loved anything with gasoline. I loved the smell and the engines. And so like the lawnmower guy would come cut the grass at our house, and I would follow him around with my toy lawnmower, because I just loved the sound and the smell of the engine. I always want to know how that stuff works. So I guess when I got older, we moved to Alabama, which is where I live now, southern state. And here at the time, it was primarily like trucks and just a whole different kind of thing, hunting. And there wasn't a lot of race car stuff here. But although we have the Barber Motorsports Museum, it's a beautiful place now where they have the Indy races and stuff. I was just kind of in my own world here, trying to fit in. And I just really dove into the computer stuff. I started building my own computers, and I would learn on the forums. That's how I would learn about different parts like motherboards and processors. And I just loved like dreaming about it. So I always had this little dream was I'm going to build my own computer. And I just loved how cool it was that you could overclock and you could get a liquid cooler for your processor. And you see, like, this is real similar to cars, right? Because cars you can modify and you can find out what's going to happen, and you want to try this and you want to try that, and we want another pound of boost. And so it's like the same kind of thing. So I went from computers, and I had that's how I would make money. I would repair people's computers. I'd go around the neighborhoods and run a newsletter, and I had a little company called Monster Box. So that's how I saved my money to get my first car. And my parents helped me a little bit. They sold an old car that we had when I was born, and I had $5,200, and I bought a Toyota Celica, and it was the 1997 105 horsepower 7 AFE four banger.
Whew.
And see, you guys had the cool one. You had the GT4 that had the 3S GT engine. I think New Zealand had that, and Japan, right?
No, we were pretty lucky, and still are, that we don't have a local automotive manufacturing industry, so there's nothing to protect. So we had essentially free access to all of the JDM models. So yeah, the ST185 and ST205 Celica GT4s, actually was that maybe a later era, can't quite remember. But yeah, must admit, I was never actually a massive fan. I spent a bit of time driving an ST205, and I found like they were just so big and heavy. And I think because there was so much weight on the front axle line, they just tended to be a big old understeery boat. But, sorry to everyone with a Celica that I've just offended.
You killed my dream. Yeah, so I never got to see one of those. They've never seen one to this day. The one that has like the higher wing in the back, it kind of looks like a mini Supra. Is that the one we're talking about? Yeah, so that was it, man. I always I would drive this little car around, and the key here is that it's about dreaming, right? So I didn't know this at the time, but that's kind of my philosophy now, is that there's like constructive daydreaming is what I call it. So I drive my Celica around, and it's got 100 horsepower, and all the kids at school have, Supras and, badass stuff. I'm just got this little four banger, but it's a 5 speed. And so I'm imagining boost noises. I'm imagining a turbocharger. I'm imagining all this stuff. And I got my eyes set on, if I sell enough computers and teach enough trumpet lessons, I can buy a 3SGT engine. Because at the time you could get, these front clips from eBay. And I could get, the whole front end of one of those cars from Japan. And I could swap a 3SGT. It also comes in the MR2. And then I could have a turbo engine. So that was my goal. Well, I got rear-ended and the car was totaled. And so that killed my dream, right? So I just started looking, and I'm hoping, wonder what's going to happen with the insurance, right? Well, I got super lucky. It's just a miracle. And I think this is because I had such big dreams that it was just the universe intervening. But I got like almost double the money that I paid for the car from insurance.
That's almost unheard of.
Yeah, I got like 10 grand.
And insurance, in my experience, is always a very one-way street, and it's only ever the insurance companies that profit out of it. But congratulations, that's great.
Right? So it was like a 1 in a million chance there. Yeah, so now I've got some cash, and I'm saving up some money. I'm going to ride the bus to school for the rest of this year. Maybe I can scrap up enough cash for an RX-7, right? Because those, like at this time, you can get an RX-7 with about 80,000 miles on it, 1994, 1993, for probably $12,000 to $15,000, and way different than it is today, right?
Yeah, look at the prices now.
Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes I think back in that era, if only you had a crystal ball and you knew what the prices of the JDM Hero cars were going to do, you could have done very well out of it, but none of us did.
Yeah, it's like $12,000 for a freaking Reman Mazda engine now, right? Just the motor, if you're lucky. So,
Oh, actually, I'll stop you there. What was, first of all, I find when I'm interviewing anyone from the US, it's always interesting when they've gravitated towards Japanese domestic market versus USDM. And then second part of this question is, what is it about the Rotaries or RX-7s that attracted you? Because I kind of find people are very divided into piston and rotary.
that is true. Well, I didn't really have a lot of experience with either at the time. So I was just kind of going on intuition or instinct or whatever you want to call it. And I think it was the Fast and the Furious. I think that was the influence primarily for me and my friends where I was located. Because I had a buddy that was a few years older than me that got a car before me, and he got an Integra. And this thing was badass, and he was always updating it and putting exhaust on it. This is before I had my license. He takes me to see the Fast and the Furious, and what's in the movie? Well, Vin Diesel's driving an RX-7, and there's all this badass Eclipse and the Supra, and I think that's what it was, man. It was like a whole nother spin. And we're here in America, so there's all muscle cars, right? That's primarily the American history, but that movie just kicked it off for the Japanese market here for the JDM stuff. And so everyone at my school, pretty much everybody that I knew anywhere I went you could have a stock Maxima and you'd be slapping an exhaust system on the back of it and underglow. And it was just crazy. It's not like it is today. It was like a household thing. Everybody was modifying their cars. And so I'm like, I got to get into this. And nobody had RX-7s, and they were like pretty good deal. So like I really wanted a Supra, but couldn't afford that one. That's like $30,000-$40,000 back then. But an RX-7, well, it could be possible. However, I didn't realize the reason that they were a good deal is because they come with a lot of requirements. You have to know your stuff, and there's not a lot of people that work on them. So that was something I was not quite aware of until I started digging into it. But so some of that was the appeal as well. It's like the experiment aspect of doing something that you don't like, that nobody else has, and that you have uncertainty. With uncertainty comes reward, if you're willing to persevere. So I'd never even seen an RX-7. I didn't know anyone that had one. That's how rare they were around here. There's only a few guys in the area. And so one of them popped up on this website, Auto Trader, which is real popular in the US at the time. And it was in Ohio, which is about 10 hours away. And so I go well, my parents are really cool. they could be really strict, but at the same time, they would allow you to argue your case. So if they disagreed with something, they'd still allow you to present a case. And a lot of times they would still say no, but if you really had a good case, maybe they would allow you to do it. So I prepare all this documentation, like I'm on the forums researching RX-7s, I'm learning about compression tests and the coolant test, the air separation tank, all these things, and who would be potential people I could link up with that could help me fix it. I've got this whole case because I know they're probably going to say, oh, this is totally not a good idea for you to spend all your money on. So I go to them and it's like a document. Okay. And I tell my dad, I'm like, I want to get this RX-7, and I've got 13,000 saved up and I can do this. I got another 1,000 in the bank in case I need to fix it.
What age are you at this point?
I'm 17.
That is truly impressive. Good job.
So I go to him and I'm like, I got this whole plan, right? And I'm thinking this is going to work out. And his response is like, basically, this is a bad idea. Like you don't need to be doing this shit. Like, first of all, it's a turbo car, which means with a turbocharger comes complication and issues. And he's not a mechanic, okay, but he's a smart guy. So I give him that. That makes sense. And then he also says, well, it's a rotary engine, and who the hell knows how to work on those? So, you're going to be driving to and from school. And then if you go to college, you're going to need a car that's reliable. I mean, what are you doing? Like this, that's why this thing is a good deal.
I can't argue with any of those points.
Exactly.
Let's be honest. The man is making good sense.
He's absolutely correct, right? But I was hard-headed in my ambition, and I had so much love for this. It just had to be this. I can't explain it. I had to have it. And so I was just like, I got to have this thing. I got to drive this car. I accept all consequences that come with this. I accept all the responsibility. And if I got to walk to school, and if I got to sell this thing for half price and go back and get another Celica, then I'll do whatever I got to do. And it was one of those things where, when someone tells you like they're not mad, but they're disappointed, it's like that kind of response. It was like, okay, well, have it your way.
So you won that battle.
That's what's important though, is because at that moment, it really put me in that like sense of, okay, I better be responsible because my parents aren't going to bail me out of this, and I better take this seriously. I better not blow this thing up. I better learn everything I can. It was like a challenge to prove to them that I was, going to figure my shit out. And then it was a challenge to myself to
figure it out.
Yeah. So that was it.
Well, let's dive into the experience. Yeah, what did the reliability prove to be like? Was it exactly what I'd expect, or did it actually prove to be perfectly reliable?
Both. It had some things that would pop up, but anything that popped up was never rotary related. And to this date, I've never really had any issues that were rotary related. It's always been other things. And I found that it was mainly the supporting things on the car. Like it would be like the radiator end tanks, because they were plastic, would crack, or it'd be the air separation tank that was plastic and it would crack, or you'd have a vacuum lines or rat's nest, which is the solenoids. It's all this kind of stuff.
Oh, the vacuum lines for the twin turbos, my God, that is just an absolute nightmare. And they just cook with the heat in that engine bay.
Yeah.
Once they've done 50, 60, 80,000 miles, everything's falling apart, and trying to figure out how that all goes. Obviously, factory documentation will tell you. But yeah, it's a drama.
Yeah, you drink from a fire hose of knowledge when you're trying to figure out all this on the rotary stuff. There's so much information that, when you're a kid, and I wasn't a mechanic. I was just working out of my parents', garage in their house. I'd go to Walmart and get, the hand jack and some tools and just go at it. But the forums were my best friend. The forums is how I learned everything. And I learned that if you ask good questions and you answer other people's questions, then people take you seriously. You kind of build a reputation, and that's how you exchange information. And it was a wonderful thing to have the access that way. I mean, today the internet's awesome too, but I feel like it's the forums are always, and you have your own forums, right? I believe, is that correct?
Yeah, we do.
Yeah. So it's such a great way to, I would read people's build threads, and that's how I kept it running. And so anytime anything would break, initially I'd be real frustrated, like, oh, this thing broke again, or this broke again. But it was like a win every time because it was never rotary related. And then I started to learn, I'm like, okay, eventually this is going to become reliable. And I got to the point where I daily drove it for 4 years.
Wow, that's amazing.
And I even daily drove it to college. And so the key was to not be greedy. You don't turn the boost up You don't ask too much from the engine. You don't ever let it overheat. You let it warm up, and you treat it like any other car, the way you should treat any other car. And man, I mean, I had a thing up to like 300, maybe 330 horsepower. It was the sequential twins. And I was running this thing called the Peter Farrell Purple Box, which people said was a terrible piggyback computer. It worked great. I don't know if you ever heard of that, the Purple Box.
No, I've never heard of that one.
Yeah, it's
Back in
just,
that day, I think the most popular option for that generation RX-7, the FD, was probably the Apexi Power FC. You know, the number of cars that would also come into New Zealand from Japan already with the Power FC installed. That was probably the main go-to. So a couple of things here. During that 4-year period, you've just mentioned about this box and the 330 horsepower, which is great. During the 4 years, what was the car modified in terms of power levels, or was it stock at that point?
well, stock would have been closer to 250 crank. So it came with the stock twins, and it had, I think the only like real upgrade was it had the catalyst downpipe, which is like one of the reliability mods, because like the pre-catalytic converter would jam up and cause a lot of heat. So that was pretty much like the only thing. And the engine had like 80,000 miles on it. So what I did was I just slowly upgraded everything that would potentially increase the reliability. So I put like a full exhaust on and get rid of the catalytic converter. And then I pulled the wastegates off, or the twin turbos off, and port the wastegate, because you can't just put a straight exhaust on, a stock rotary, or it'll boost creep. So I learned of like how wastegates work by doing that, right? So everything that I'm doing, I'm learning so much from all of it. And, upgrade the secondary injectors, and this computer could handle that. I believe that's something I did. I can't remember. Maybe that was on another engine that I had. But essentially, it was stock twins, and I redid all the vacuum lines with the silicone hoses, put a stock mount intercooler that's, aluminum with aluminum piping, and Koyo inflow radiator. And yeah, and it was great.
So basically, supporting mods.
Yeah, supporting mods, and the thing ran beautifully, man, for so many years. Never had an issue, never had a starting issue, never had the, that hot start problem, nothing. And this is on stock Apex Hills, and I just followed all the rules, and I really respected the car, and I think that's why it did me well. And it was funny because I had all these friends. I mean, we used to go to these street races that, people don't talk about, but there used to be these big street races downtown at night. And when I'd go out there and watch, but I'd always be real careful. And my friends would have these Subarus, and they'd blow their engines left and right. And then there were these SRT4 neons. We called them Skittles. I don't know why we called them Skittles, but everybody's running like 40 pounds of boost on those things, and they're lifting heads. And, and it's like,
so, how about that? Yeah.
Right. So I outlived everybody because and I'm the rotary guy who's supposed to, boost goes in, Apex Hills comes out. And that just gave me confidence. I'm like, well, maybe this thing can be really reliable if you just fix all the junk around it that just was, cutting corners on Mazda's part to meet the budget, so you just give it what it needs, it lives.
I think my personal stance on this has always been that the rotaries get a bad reputation for reliability for a couple of reasons. One, when we're starting to talk about built engines, and we'll get deeper into all of this as we go anyway, but when you're talking about built engines, because on face value, they seem like they're relatively simple. There's no valves, valve springs, cams, etc. Not as many moving parts. So it seems on face value like it's an easy win to build one of these in your home shed. And don't get me wrong, obviously that can be done, but like anything, it requires attention to detail and the correct amount of knowledge. And I think you get a lot of people putting these together without either of those things. Maybe your shed's near the beach and there's sand blowing in the door, whatever. So you're setting yourself up for failure with an engine that hasn't been assembled correctly. And then the other knock-on effect of this is, tuners who aren't experienced in rotary engines and try tuning the rotary engine like a piston engine, and they need to be dealt with carefully. And I remember back when I was running my old shop, you'd get guys booking a rotary for a tune, and they'd look like they'd just lost their grandmother as they're unloading the car off the trailer because they're already expecting, before the thing's even bolted to the dyno, they're already expecting that it's going to be broken. That was just how it went. So, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, you treat them correctly, tune them carefully, get them built properly, and they can actually be reliable.
Yeah, 100%. It's weird. I have not really had a rotor related issue. I mean, I had an issue that was rotor related, but it was due to the engine not being built correctly, which is exactly what you said. But when I got into tuning cars, which we'll get to that later, but just real quick, when I got into tuning cars, I really learned that it didn't matter if it was a rotary. This is the same kind of problems that I would see. Like I started with like Mustangs and Corvettes and stuff. I was contract tuning for a speed shop here, so it was primarily American stuff. But I had a few Miatas, Mega Squirts, things like that. But it was always the same thing, right? And you've probably seen it. Fuel pump wasn't wired correctly. It burns out the pins for the tank hat wiring, or relay doesn't give enough juice, or the ignition system isn't set up, or a crank sensor. It's always like that kind of stuff, right? And so on a piston engine, you got a little bit of forgiveness there because you can hear a little bit of knock if you lose some fuel pressure and maybe it didn't blow the thing up. The rotary engine, you don't get that forgiveness. So if you keep it within the targets on air fuel ratio, timing, and yada yada, and temperature and all that, then I think it honestly could be one of the most reliable engines. It's just that the fact that it's inefficient is why it was probably discontinued, and the fact that it didn't have competition in the marketplace, that not a lot of people picked it up. So Mazda was only able to go so far with it because of the budgets that they had. And if you imagine if all companies were competing on the rotary platform, then it could have been one of the greatest engines ever. So I think it just, my philosophy on it is treat it like it's any other engine. And if you're tuning a 4G motor, or you're tuning a 3S or a 2JZ, like, you should have the same philosophy. They try not to knock the motor.
100%.
I mean, right? And then I think you'll be rewarded with a rotary. So now, again, I'm not a race car driver. I'm not pushing these cars for competition, so I can't really comment on that aspect. But obviously, Mazda figured it out with their racing series, because they were there's the Patrick Dempsey cars that were racing those three rotors with the Riley Motorsports cars. It was super reliable, and same thing with the 787B program. Now, obviously, those cars had different supporting characteristics, but when they really buckled down and put all the engineering into them, they proved to be extremely reliable. I mean, those 24-hour cars with the ceramic apex seals continued to run, many years after the events, because the apex seal wear was real slight. I mean, I've heard when they tear those engines down, like, the engines still look really nice. They just refresh them. So
I think your point you made there is really valid there. It's kind of the rotary engine, the tuning approach is very similar to piston, but the tuning envelope, the window for keeping a rotary engine alive, just becomes much narrower. And yeah, you can run a piston engine into light detonation. It's obviously not something we try to do, but you can do that and it's going to live through it. Whereas a rotary engine, you're probably not going to be that lucky.
yes, agreed, 100%. You don't get that margin of error, so you got to be real careful. So it's tighter margin.
If you're a fan of the podcast and you're interested in topics like engine tuning, automotive wiring, performance engine building, 3D modeling in CAD, or anything else in the high-performance industry, I have something that you might be interested in. Introducing the High Performance Academy VIP package. This package of courses gives you lifetime access to all of HPA's online training for one price. These courses cover everything from tuning and reflashing petrol and diesel engines, through to motorsport wiring, engine building, fabrication, design, car setup, and plenty more. Right now, you can get $500 off High Performance Academy's VIP package using the code PODCAST500 at checkout. Becoming a VIP means you'll never pay for another course again. You'll get instant access to all 40 plus courses we currently offer, plus every new course we ever release in the future. Want to define maps or tune with WinOLS? Curious about CAN bus devices, or how CAD can help make your dream build a reality? These in-depth topics, as well as many others, each have their own dedicated course that are going to help you master whatever it is you want to learn. And as a VIP member, you're not just getting the courses, you'll also join HPA's online community with lifetime access to our member forums and members' webinar lessons. Again, the code is podcast500 for that $500 discount. Just head over to hpacademy.com to check out the full VIP package and everything it contains. All right, let's get back to the episode. Just talking about sort of your trajectory here, because you mentioned the tuning side of things. I'm really interested to dig into how you started to develop those skills. I mean, essentially, the reason that we are here talking to you today, and the reason that High Performance Academy exists, is because I created the resource that I would have loved to have access to when I was trying to learn how to tune, and I had to do it the hard way by trial and error. So yeah, just talk us through that.
Yeah, certainly. So I went to school for music after, high school. I went to college to learn music. Ended up getting a major in music and business so that I have a fallback. That was my original goal, was to be a trumpet player and an orchestra player. But I just didn't love it enough. So you have to really love something more than just doing it. You have to love the day in, day out of that. And the thing I really loved was cars. So I would use my real estate. I became a commercial appraiser, and I would use my real estate job, which is what I do now, to be able to fund my side quest, which is the Rotary stuff. And I didn't have my mindset on the Rotary stuff as in like, this is going to be my career. So I always did it as like a passion thing, but I just really loved it. So that motivation was led me to a bunch of different places with it. And so when I finally, got out of school and, I still had the RX-7, I always wanted to do a single turbo, but I knew, okay, I need to live within my means until I could afford it. But I'm still doing that constructive dreaming. So I'd pace back and forth in my apartment at school, and I'd do spreadsheets and I'd read and research about all the things required to do a single turbo, so that by the time I graduated and I had the money to do it, I already knew exactly what deal to take whenever I saw it. And so I found an engine swap that could essentially be put right in place. Like it came with the turbo, the ECU, like all of it, and the motor. So that's when I really started to get serious. And I swapped the engine, and it was up and running in about 48 hours. Really cool to be able to pull that off. And it was a good deal. It came from a guy that built the proper setup, and he was moving on to an LS platform. So that's when I started learning a little bit about tuning, because I had to take that car and have it dyno tuned. And it was on an AEM version 2 ECU. So that was the first time having a standalone. Is that's when I started to see the interface of the laptop stuff. And, I can look at his map and see what timing is doing and air fuel and all of that. And so fast forward from there, I wasn't the tuner, but I witnessed it happening. So I started to understand, air fuel ratios and timing. And I'm hearing the lingo and starting to get a little bit of, I bought a wideband, a Z-Tronics. And so I would always track the air fuel because I want to be careful. So now I'm making like 500 horsepower on pump gas, and I'm using methanol injection. So now we're really flirting with that edge, right? It's like 22, 23 PSI. And that's the territory where if it's not dialed in, you're going to knock and hurt the motor. And again, it was reliable. I mean, I made 500 plus for years on that. And then what I did was I ended up selling the old setup that I had, that was my high school setup, to be able to afford to do the current setup, which was the single turbo. And then I had enough money saved up to do a 3-rotor. I'm like, okay, this stuff is just, it's challenging, but I love it enough that I seem to be succeeding. So let me try again. So then I sold that motor and I purchased a 3-rotor. And that's when I really had to start buckling down and figure out what's going on. And that's when I started dabbling tuning myself, because there was a guy that tuned that project for me originally, but I had to do some touch up stuff, because a tune's like never 100%. The dyno doesn't necessarily match the real world, and when you're dealing with a rotary engine and conditions change and things like that, like you might need to make adjustments. So I'm like, maybe I need to add a little bit more fuel here, or maybe I need to, it's got a little hesitation, let me play with the accelerator pump settings. And so that's when I started getting more comfortable with it, but I still wasn't confident enough to be doing my own mapping. Then the same thing again, I sold the whole car and wanted to do a 4-rotor project. So I sold that whole car, ended up coming way off on top. Again, like made a lot of money on it, which is like 1 in a million chance. I'm thinking, okay, if I'm doing this well with this thing and I'm making profitability, then why not just take the uncertainty again? Just go again, while I'm young, while I can risk it. So then I did a 4-rotor setup, and I built a whole nother car with that. And this is the first time that I, experienced like doing all the wiring and outsource. Like I outsource the harness, but I'm understanding inputs and outputs, and understanding all the different sensors. And the 4-rotor is like, you're really like, there's so much you have to learn now, because doing a 4-rotor is not just a straightforward process. It's kind of like everybody has their own process to how you're going to achieve that. Now I know it's possible to do a 4-rotor because I've seen other people do it, but doing it correctly is kind of subjective, right? And so that car ended up with had a lot of challenges, and I learned a lot because we had to rebuild the engine, and we had to redesign the exhaust manifold twice, and the intake design, a whole lot of stuff that we had to redo. And in doing that, I learned enough to where I was like, okay, I can do this myself. I can tune this myself. And so there was a gentleman that tuned it for me initially in California, and he did a great job. His name was Abel Ibarra. He's a world record NHRA drag racer.
Had is it an RX2 or an R100 that was really famous? I think it was the K&N Filters one, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think it was a R100. He also had a three rotor RX8.
R100. Yeah, no, I remember.
He had a three rotor RX8 that was like record too. So he did a really good job on the car, but the drivability just suffered. And I can't blame him for that. It's just really hard to get a peripheral port to be a drivable vehicle. And so when I got the car back to Birmingham, I just wasn't happy with the accelerator enrichment settings and some of these kind of things. I wanted it to be smoother. So weird is some of my friends were working at this performance shop that was like doing Mustangs and cars like that. And they had a dyno, and the dyno tuner, the guy that worked for them, ended up quitting. And so they were in a jam and they didn't have anybody to tune their cars, and they were looking for a tuner. And they were like, do you want to just like try to hold us over for the next few weeks? Here's some books. And I'm like, shit. I get like kind of what you said. Like,
Wow.
if you can tune a rotary, well, then you probably can tune a piston engine. I'm like, okay, I know a little bit about, I know my way around the Haltech. I understand the concepts. I just haven't physically done it. But if I can do the standalone stuff and dabble with it, then I can at least handle HP tuners, a flash tune on a Mustang, because there's more forgiveness. So I tuned like a bunch of cars, and it ended up not being there 2 weeks, but like a year plus. And so I had a lot of experience with a bunch of different piston engines. And that's when I discovered all the things that we were talking about with everybody that comes in. They're like, oh yeah, this thing's ready to go. I'm like, no, it's not. The fuel pressure dropped. So
Yeah. All right, I'm gonna stop you there, David, because we've got at the moment about 1 million follow-up questions that I want to ask. So if we come back one step, and this is not really tuning related, you're just talking about the four rotor and peripheral ports. Actually, let's come back one step and just talk about the typical porting options that we see on rotary engines. So typically we've got a side port that's relatively mild in a stock engine, and there's extend ports, bridge ports, and then the holy grail is we go straight through the rotor housing with a peripheral port. Can you give us a quick rundown on, I guess, pros and cons of each in terms of power, tunability, and drivability?
Yeah, so the side port is going to be most similar to the factory. When they say side port, it's generally like a street port. People talk about a street port. It's just a larger, porting of the side port. You're extending the intake duration by opening up the size of that, and that's going to give you a little bit more power. It's kind of like having a longer duration cam on a piston engine, as far as I understand. But then you can do like bridge porting, which is where you take that even further. And these are just more extreme options. And the air is coming in through this intermediate plates instead of directly into the rotor housing. That's how it enters the rotor housing. It's entering from the side of the rotor. And so the thing about the side port is you have higher intake velocity because you have more ports, because you have more plates than you do. Like, it's just the dynamics of it makes the intake velocity faster, and so the engine is easier to drive around, and you also generally don't have as much overlap unless it's a really extreme bridge, meaning that your intake and your exhaust are not open at the same time as much. And so that's much easier for an engine that is turbocharged, because when you have a turbocharger, you have to be careful with the overlap, because you can end up with a situation where that vacuum, the reason you hear them brap and they go brap, 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 it's the same thing as a big cam on an NA motor. The intake and the exhaust are open so long that you're pulling the vacuum in the intake manifold is sucking exhaust back through, the intake port. And so when you're under boost and you end up with back pressure in the turbine housing, you can actually push exhaust back through the inlet. So there's just like basically peripheral porting is the most extreme form. But when you peripheral port a motor, you're putting the air directly into the rotor housing instead of having those side ports. You're actually blocking the side ports off. And a lot of people use epoxy to do that, like a liquid metal type deal. But I think it gives you a throatier, deeper sound, and it can give you more power in the upper power band. but it increases your volumetric efficiency, just like a cam. But you have to be really careful if you have a turbocharger that you don't actually end up with a net loss from that because of your back pressure is refeeding exhaust back through the intake. So that's one thing. And then also your low end drivability, it can cause the car to want to buck and kick on, on and off throttle because of the fact that the intake velocity is slower since you have bigger runners. So there's a balancing act here. And I chose the peripheral port just because it's cleaner and it's actually simpler to do on a 4-rotor engine or a 5-rotor engine because of the fact that you can get away with 4 runners on a 4-rotor or 5 runners on a 5-rotor rather than 10.
Yeah, it definitely reduces the complexity of fabricating an intake manifold for sure. In terms of what you've just talked about, really the comparison to a piston engine with a very large cam with a lot of overlap and duration, it does really hold true, because we do see, you start getting into cam duration for a full-on race engine, and they're not going to idle at 600 RPM anymore, and they're not going to drive really nicely until you're up higher in the rev range. So kind of the same thing. Is the ways of combating this poor drivability with these, let's say Bridgeport and peripheral port engines with modern ECUs, the amount of control we've got now, or is it just impossible to get perfect drivability with that kind of porting option?
Well, I think you can get close. I don't think you're ever going to get it to drive like a side port or a mild cam engine. You're always going to have, I guess people will call it like cam lash if it was a V8, but you can get close. Now it's exacerbated by having a dog ring gearbox, and that backlash really brings it out, and especially like on this transaxle based car where you don't have any slack in the drivetrain from, a guibo or drive shaft. You really feel it. But you can really get around it by transient throttle enrichment settings, which I've found to be just wild, the stuff that I'm using. Now, I think a lot of that has to do with the placement of the injector, because it's not easy to place the injector close to the motor directly into the port on a peripheral engine if you want it to be clean fabrication wise. And so now that your injector is further away, there's more delay at trying to get that fuel into the motor, and you're dealing with the fact that you have low intake velocity. So you end up with this like transient period of time when you stab the accelerator that the fuel is going from a suspended state under vacuum, almost like a gaseous state is how I would imagine it. And then you stab the throttle, it falls out of the suspension, and now you got to cram that air into the engine really quickly before the boost hits. And so you'll get like these lean hiccups, and the car will be stuck in this like bucking process. And people probably seen it in my video when I'm tuning the car, the 5-rotor car. You can see that happening. And so what I find is that they want just a ridiculous amount of transient enrichment fuel, like way more than you would ever realize, so high that you think something's wrong, and you end up putting so much damn transient enrichment in. But you have to do it for a very short duration. So incredibly quick duration, but a really big punch. And that gets them running really crisp. And so I was able to get, this 5-rotor car is fairly responsive. It does have a little bucking because of the super lightweight flywheel. And again, because it's transaxle, that's sequential, or dog rings, the banging around. But if you get after it, I mean, it's really clean and crisp once you do the work on that transient enrichment. So that's what it all comes down to with the ECU. And the other thing, which not to give away too much information, but this would be helpful to people that are trying to do these kind of setups, is I find that you actually have to scale the enrichment per load. So not just the same transient enrichment settings for, fourth gear just applies to the whole car. Generally, you can get away with that on like a side port. You use the same if you can get it, stabbing at 4,000 RPMs in fourth, it's probably good in fifth. But I find that I've tuned a few peripheral turbo cars now and semi-peripheral that maybe you don't notice it, but you can see it on the semis or the bridges, but you definitely notice it and feel it on the peripherals. If you use the same amount of transient throttle at fourth gear that you do in sixth gear will be a lot more lean, and you'll have a big pop when you nail the throttle. So you actually have to do, all the way from neutral, first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth has to have its own transient throttle enrichment table. And then you scale for each gear position. And then I also have the clutch set up to where when I do a blip, if I'm going to do a clutched downshift, I don't like to do a clutchless downshift. I think it's just unnecessary wear unless you're really racing. But when you do that blip, you have to account for that too. So now you need to have a neutral override to make it free rev really nice. So the enrichment settings for a free rev, as opposed to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all different. And that's what takes the majority of the time to get the peripheral right. The other thing is that you get, I feel like, kind of a a lying air fuel ratio. I don't believe that the air fuel ratio is always exactly what you think it is. And I think that that's because you're getting this pulsing coming in and out of the motor, that it's diluting some of that, the combustion mixture with inert gas, because of the inevitable amount of reversion that's occurring. So you really have to, what I do is I try to tune them as rich as they'll possibly run until they misfire. And then when they misfire, I know that that must be rich. Right. And then I back off until it no longer misfires. And that's about where I keep my air fuel ratio. It doesn't really matter what the absolute value is.
That's a good point. I think it's very easy to get sort of tied up on what the wideband is telling you, but you're absolutely right. I mean, it's no different to tuning a really big cam piston engine with a lot of overlap, and particularly at idle. With all of the overlap that's going on, you're getting basically absolute garbage out of your lambda sensor. So I've always thought it's a case of understanding what's going on and then basically giving the engine what it needs in order to give you the right results, as opposed to I need to tune for X air fuel ratio and be damned how the engine's actually responding. I think that's that closed down attitude that a lot of tuners will have when they first get started, and as you start building up some experience and you sort of understand more of what's going on, you realize that that's not going to get you results in every situation. Hey, maybe you're tuning a stock engine with small cam or side ports in the case of a rotary engine. That'll get you by. It's just a case of giving the engine what it wants.
To add to that, I don't have a lot of experience with this because, for me, this is a hobby. So I'm kind of, in my own world with this, but I do talk to a lot of people. I mean, everything to me is as much information as I get my hands on, I appreciate. So I try to talk to as many tuners as possible. And my method is always, ask a million questions, even if you look silly. People will talk to each other and say, did he just call you and ask you the same question? And then I'll get the consensus from everybody, and then I'll make my determination from that. But in doing that, okay, I've learned that a lot of the drag racer guys seem to, from my perspective, okay, so no hate to anybody, but from my perspective, it seems to be a lot what you're saying. And I don't blame them for it, because if this works, then why not repeat it? But I think a lot of people in the drag racing, and respect them because they're going super fast, running crazy boost on some of these 13Bs, like 70 PSI, right? Methanol. But they kind of have like this strict absolute values that they chase. And so specifically to that, I want to talk about exhaust gas temperature. And this is something that I was just curious to know your thoughts on, on or off the podcast. So there's been this kind of a school of thought, and I don't think everybody subscribes to this, but, for example, one of the Apex seal manufacturers told me, do not run this Apex seal over the EGT of 1650 Fahrenheit. Now, I can't remember what that converts to in Celsius. Was that like 800 degrees Celsius or something?
I'm just going to figure out exactly that, because I cannot convert from Fahrenheit to Celsius in my head. It's... Yeah. What do we got? 900 C. So there we go. Yeah, that's a number I can get my head around.
Yeah. So they'll say there's this absolute limit, 900 C. Okay. And then like some of the Le Mans guys told me the same thing on NA cars. Tune it to 900 C. Okay. So I think that there's like this. There's this thought that if you go hotter than that, you're going to melt the apex seal. Okay. But the thing is, like, the exhaust gas temperature to me, and I could be wrong, I don't think it necessarily represents the actual temperature of the apex seal. It depends on the situation.
100%.
Right? So it depends on whether or not the other conditions, right? So there's two conditions here. There could be the condition where the engine's running really lean, and that's why your EGT is really high. But there could be another condition where you just have a retarded timing and the engine's really rich and the EGT is really high.
You just absolutely nailed exactly what's going on there. That is why EGT can't be considered in isolation, in my opinion. People try and link EGT to combustion temperature, because obviously the apex seal, as far as that's concerned, it's the combustion temperature that matters. We can't measure the combustion temperature, so we're using EGT as a proxy for what's going on inside the combustion chamber. Fine, that's all we've got access to, but we need to understand that, as you said, not only is the EGT going to be affected by boost and air fuel ratio, but it's also going to be affected by your ignition timing. So if you're running super conservative timing, which a lot of rotary tuners will do for obvious reasons, yeah, your EGT is going to be up for the same air fuel ratio. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that your combustion temperature is up, but you're reading that higher EGT. The other aspect of this, which is so easy to overlook, is the importance of where your EGT sensors are in the exhaust manifold. You're going to get a difference in your EGT reading if it's right by the exhaust port, and it's going to also be much higher if you're in the center of the runner versus the side of it.
Mm-hmm.
The further away you move from the exhaust port. So there's all of these things that are so important. And when people are, open and closed tip. So, I mean, we wouldn't typically run an open tip EGT sensor in a turbocharged engine, particularly in a rotary engine, because they're just not going to last. But they respond quicker. In my own experience with my drag car, you got a higher EGT reading from an exposed tip sensor compared to an enclosed tip sensor. It becomes a moot point because they simply don't last. And then the final part I was going to say about this is a lot of people are using EGT sensors for individual cylinder, or in your case, individual rotor fuel trimming. Most people would expect that every rotor or every cylinder is running the same, but that's simply not the case. We can get biases in our intake manifolds. There's a range of different aspects there. But if you're going to use them for that purpose, it's critical that every sensor is installed the same depth and the same distance from the header flange, because otherwise kind of all bets are off. I actually went a little further than this as well with one of our development cars here in New Zealand, which was since sold. This was a piston engine, but we installed individual cylinder EGT plus individual cylinder lambda. And we found that when you match the EGT within, let's say, 15 degrees C, the air fuel ratio actually wasn't the same.
Wow.
The air fuel ratio, when you match the air fuel ratio on the 4 individual cylinder lambda sensors, then you actually got a variation in the EGT. I can't remember now, but it might have been 50 or 60 degrees C. So there's just not a lot of black and white in this, and it's that Dunning-Kruger effect of, you think you know everything, and then the further you go into this, the more you find out, the more you realize there's so much more to learn.
So true, man. That's the whole reason to do it, is to find out these things. This is why I love it. I tell my friends, and we joke about it, I don't really care about it working as much as I do about knowing how and why it works. So it's just like, this is the greatest information, what you just said, because I've never had the experience to be able to do that, to test the actual air fuel ratio. And especially when you have a multiple rotors, like when you're dealing with 5, right, with a single plenum, it can be really risky to be making these significant adjustments to try to chase uniform temperature across all the rotors. And, I stumbled across this aviation paper that was talking about back in the old days when you had to trim your EGTs at altitude as your measurement for, your mixture from, the density of the altitude. And they were saying, do not try to equalize all of your EGTs. You'll blow a piston up. So kind of my thought on this in regards to the drag cars is, I've got a buddy that is in, I'm not going to call him out, but there's a buddy that I know of in one of the northern states, and he's got a beautiful car and he races it, and he's frustrated with it because he's pushing the limits, in my opinion, of E85. So E85, big difference from pump gas, obviously, because you have the extra octane and cooling potential. However, it still has its limit, right? So if you're going to push E85 to 60 PSI, I believe he's around 55, 65 PSI.
Yeah, time for methanol.
Yeah, you're starting to flirt with the edge, right? And so just running the engine really rich. So what they're doing, what they've told me they do, is they'll run it to the point at which it misfires, and then they pull back. And they'll say it actually, a lot of the drag guys will get it to gargle on the dyno, the sound of like a little gargling in and out, like a kind of like a ghosty misfire. And then they say, okay, then that's going to make it be able to handle the track conditions, because on the track it might heat up and use more fuel. Okay, so they put it right on the edge, all right, and then they give it enough timing to keep the EGT under 900. And so I'm saying, okay, don't give it enough timing to pull the EGT. Don't use the EGT as absolute value. And I'm like, well, how much timing? They're like 15, 16 degrees. Okay, so that doesn't sound like a lot of timing. But when you consider that you're running 65 pounds of boost,
That's a lot of timing.
you have to look at your intake air temperature, right? Well, your intake air temperature is going to be a delay. You're not going to see the actual intake air temperature the immediate that it hits with all that CFM. You're kind of seeing it on the backside after you left the throttle. So even though it goes to 160 Fahrenheit or 200 Fahrenheit, it might actually be hotter than that because you're just not capturing that information unless you have a K-type thermocouple on your intake, right? So if you're pushing that degree of timing and they're saying, oh, the apex seals are warping, they're not seeing knock, they're not seeing detonation to the extent of rotors like denting and stuff, but they're seeing the apex seals warp. And they're like, they warped it. We have to put them back together. So what I'm saying is pull that sucker back to 10 degrees or 8 degrees or 6 degrees of timing. Make sure you got a big ignition system on there like a CDI. Run it as rich as you can, and maybe even consider adding water injection, not water methanol, water injection. Get the combustion chamber temperatures down. You're trading one side of the engine to the other. The higher the EGTs go by retarding timing means that it, in my opinion, it's actually getting cooler on the combustion side. And that's the consequence of, the inefficiency on one side becomes hotter on the other. And then you're only worried about melting the turbo, not warping your apex seals.
That's another good point that I was going to raise there. We do need to still be mindful of EGT in the fact of the matter our turbine wheel material is going to only withstand so much temperature for an extended period of time. I mean, I think sort of the current crop of turbos, maybe sort of 1,050 C is about the limit there. So yeah, I mean, I would have also said that 15 to 16 degrees timing with 60 pound of boost, even on E85 fuel, is crazy, very optimistic. I don't think I would quite be there. Interesting though, so when we talk about air fuel ratio targets for rotary engines, and I'll use AFR instead of lambda, which I typically tune in. For a typical piston engine running pump gas, turbocharged piston engine running pump gas, and let's say it's 20 psi of boost, we might be running somewhere in the region of like maybe 11.5 to 12.0 to 1. You could go a little bit leaner than that. What's your sort of take on target air fuel ratios? We've already talked about the fact that you're not taking this necessarily as gospel, but what sort of target air fuel ratio would you be looking at for a comparable stock 13B, running the same sort of boost pressure?
Yeah, if we were talking about an engine that didn't have a lot of overlap where we could really trust the sensor data, my targets would be without a doubt 11.0, maybe richer. It depends on the boost, but if you're going to run up to 1 bar, it probably needs to be around 11.0, maybe at 11.2. I wouldn't go any leaner than that. I find that the gains are just going to come in more boost. So add boost and, keep it rich. And if your ignition system can handle more fuel, then you can take it down to mid tens. I mean, because what you'll find is you can run retarded timing. And I think the timing is really what's going to dictate the longevity of the engine. Push the timing as low as you can to where you're happy with, the temperature's not so high you're going to melt the turbine off. So really the timing is like, you got to find that happy medium where you're not going to melt the turbine off, but you want to err on the side of caution, leave it pulled back. So like, if we're going to run like 1 bar, say pump gas, right? To me, that's going to be the limit. I'm not going to go much over 1 bar, maybe 16 PSI. Then I'm going to have the timing somewhere between, maybe like 12 degrees, 13 degrees. And people might think that's really conservative, but I think I'm at the knock limit of the fuel. I'm starting to flirt with that. And then I'm going to run, a 10.5 if the ignition system will take it. And whatever the power makes is the power that it makes. I'm not going to sacrifice reliability for an extra like 20, 30 horsepower that you could get by leaning it out. And you'll find that my engines have always lasted. Now, again, I'm not competing and I'm not running multiple laps and stuff, but for cars that I drive on the street and have had them last for years, that's always been the recipe, is as much fuel as they'll take before they start really falling off and misfiring.
Okay, so I think this is where the difference in your philosophy comes into compared to a piston engine tuner. So piston engines, we will typically run, as I mentioned, a leaner air fuel ratio, maybe 11.5 to 12.0, something like that. And you'll find that with those piston engines, you go much richer than 11.5, you're going to start to see the power drop away. And once you go probably richer than maybe 11.0, 10.8, the power's going to fall off a cliff. And, unless you've got a hell of an ignition system, you're probably going to find that 10.5 is probably about the rich limit.
So you'll see it fall off on power despite it not even misfiring? Like if you went from a 10.8 to a 10.0, you'll just see a big hit in power?
Correct.
Yeah, we don't notice that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I don't notice that on the rotary. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. So my experience has actually been the polar opposite. Like our FDRX7, if I run that at 1 bar of boost and 11.5, we'll make, I don't know, let's call it 400 horsepower just for round numbers. I don't know what it actually would be. And I go sort of 11.0, I probably lose, as you were talking about before, sort of 15, 20 horsepower. 10.5, that's probably about the point where the ignition system's had enough as well, and you might lose another 20 horsepower. So I think a piston engine tuner's mentality will be like, well, we lost horsepower, so let's lean it back out. And they're also applying that same approach to the ignition timing. So the way you tune a piston engine, you'll start with a conservative retarded timing, add a couple of degrees, see what it does to your power and torque. Yep, everything's okay. We're listening for knock. We'll add a couple of degrees. So we're creeping up on MBT timing until we either reach MBT or alternatively, we start to hear the onset of detonation. Obviously, then we stop, we pull it back, add a safety buffer. Now, I think when you start applying that approach to rotary engines, it becomes incredibly dangerous because now you've got a lean air fuel ratio and now you're adding timing. The rotary engine is going to be more prone to detonation because of the higher combustion temperature of the lean air fuel ratio. And you'll start to see those gains in power and torque, but you're flirting with disaster. One other aspect, if you look, it's hard to do this without some visuals, but if you looked at the relationship between torque on a dyno at a fixed steady state RPM and load on a piston engine, and you did a spark sweep between, let's say, 0 degrees and 50 degrees, you're going to see initially from 0, which is obviously very retarded, you're going to see a very sharp increase in torque with every degree you add in. And then you'll find that once you get to maybe 20 degrees, it'll start to plateau or flatten off a little bit more. And then maybe 25 degrees, that's where it plateaus. You find MBT. And then as you advance the timing beyond the MBT, you'll start to see the torque fall away again. Now, if you do that on a rotary, and I highly recommend no one does, but you will see the same trend or a similar trend, but the relationship, the magnitude of gains you get per degree of timing are nowhere near as significant as the piston engine. That whole curve is much flatter. It's a long-winded way of saying it's not worth chasing, in my opinion, torque and power on a rotary engine with timing, because the gains per degree of timing aren't massive and the repercussions of running even into light detonation are just so drastic. So I tend to add a little bit of timing from a very conservative point, and once I first start to see that my torque increase per degree of timing is just starting to drop away, I'll leave it there or even pull a bit of timing out.
100%. I'm on the exact same page as you. And in fact, I on my engine, I mean, it's been a while. I haven't had EGTs on a side port, but on the peripheral port, I don't really care so much about the torque curve, like what you're saying, like the point of diminishing returns. So like I'll do exactly what you said. I'll add maybe a degree or two, or I'll subtract a degree or two just to kind of see where we're at, like what the percentage change difference is on the torque of the dyno. And then I'm also looking at the best EGT, like what's the result in EGT, because I'm going to lean towards the most conservative timing. So I'm always going to be much further back than what you would expect. Okay. And then the only reason I'm going to add a little bit back in is not for power. It's going to be to keep the exhaust from getting too hot. So like this 5-rotor engine, for example, the cool thing about it is that it's got so much displacement. You don't need to ask a lot, right? So I keep the timing way back, and I also keep the split really wide, and then just make the power with the displacement, even if it's not very efficient, because it's going to last. And I think that's the name of the game, and just enough timing to where it's not so hot that you're melting the exhaust off the car. The thing that I'm really focused on this car is the EGT variance. I see some weird characteristics, like rotor 5 at idle is much cooler than 1, 2, 3, 4. And then when you start getting into boost, all of them are coming up But then as you get to the top of the power band, 1 and 5 creep away from 2, 3, and 4, which is not the same characteristics as the 4 rotor, which have identical intake manifold characteristics and designs and lengths. So it's really strange that there's these variations. And I'm really glad that you hit on the fact that, you put individual lambda sensors and did not see a 1-to-1 correlation with, with the exhaust temperature. So I'm kind of trying to think how to investigate this out. My biggest fear is always, when you're looking at your comprised air fuel ratio, that it's not speaking for, the leanest rotor or whatnot.
Well, no, I mean you're only seeing the lambda sensor post turbocharger is measuring the average of all of your rotors or cylinders. So I think that's another aspect that's very easy to overlook. You trust that implicitly, but all it takes is to have 1 or 2 rotors that are quite lean, maybe one rotor that's way too rich, and your wideband is going to give you what you think you should be chasing. But obviously you've got 1 or 2 rotors that could be right on the brink of destruction.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, one way I've been able to prove it, what I'm still trying to work this out, is I'll add a bunch of fuel to one of the rotors until, like, okay, let's say that one of the rotors is hot. It's reading hotter than the other 4. Okay, like rotor 1, it seems like the outlier that doesn't make sense, right? Because we've moved the injector around, we've moved the ignition around, we've double checked the compression, blah, 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 checked all the things, right? But number 1's still getting hot under boost. Okay, so then let's throw a lot of fuel at number 1 to the point at which we start hearing a misfire. Okay, but we haven't touched the comprised air fuel ratio. The target's still the same. So we're just isolating number 1 because he's running the hottest, and we're going to throw a shit ton of fuel at him. Now, if we start hearing an audible misfire, obviously it has to be misfiring on number 1. And then the peculiar thing is that the EGT isn't dropping in line with the other 4. So that tells me that the EGT is not representing the actual air fuel ratio in combustion chamber 1, despite the fact that the probes are in the same spot, the lengths, the runners, and all the stuff is jiving. So the other thing to consider, not to get too sidetracked here, the eccentric shaft design. Okay, we assume that the lobe angle offsets are always exactly accurate. And I had a 4-rotor engine that was initially built by somebody else, and then we rebuilt it in the United States when we had issues. And when we actually blueprinted the crankshaft and had a look at it, the lobe angle offsets were not always 90 degrees. Like rotor 1 to 2 was more like 88 degrees, and another one's like 92 degrees. And I'm not really sure how much that would play into this, but obviously, if every rotor is not hitting at its respective top dead center 90 degrees from the other on an engine that's even firing 90 degrees, well, that's going to affect your EGT and your combustion chamber efficiency rotor to rotor.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, I think that's sort of things that we like to expect that we can take for granted, but clearly we can't. So that'd be no different than having the crank throws out on a piston engine. I mean, at that point, yeah, all bets are off. Now, something you just mentioned, and again, rotary specific here, just before you mentioned the trailing split or rotary split. Rotary engines have a leading and a trailing spark plug, and they fire at slightly different times. Can you give us a bit of an understanding of the importance of rotary split and maybe why we shouldn't be using rotary split to try and chase more power and torque?
Yeah, certainly. So the split timing dictates when the trailing spark fires after the leading plug, unless you want to actually fire it before the leading plug. So, again, all the things that we've been talking about is about relation to power. So these things are not necessarily the same fundamentals for drivability. But like when you're in power, the trailing plug is exposed to the combustion stroke like a lot earlier than the leading plug. And so if you were to fire them off at the same time as the rotor's coming around, as far as I understand, like you can cause detonation or knock because it's just not in the same place on the rotor housing, and they're kind of like opposing each other. So you want to fire that trailing spark behind the leading spark, like by a certain amount of degrees. And like the factory traditionally does it like maybe 15 degrees behind the leading. So like if you're leading ignition timing, which is when we're talking standard timing, and this is for the audience, right? 15 degrees. Okay. Well, then if you had a 15-degree split, then as far as I understand, your trailing would be firing it like at 0 because it's 15 degrees behind the leading, right? Okay, so now I haven't tried this because I'm not going to flirt with, the edge of pain, but maybe you've tried it on the dyno. However, I have found that pulling that split timing back to maybe 12 degrees or 10 degrees might give me a little bit more power but not a significant amount of torque increase or EGT drop. So just leaving it at 12 to 15 doesn't seem to be a big of a difference from, running it at, 10 degrees. I haven't really gone any lower than that. I've experimented with ethanol. So I just don't ever really want to run the risk of that potential knock occurring by running them too tight. And so what the theory is basically, like, you could run a tighter split with less leading ignition, or you could run a wider split with more leading ignition. I would rather just run them both conservative because, let's just make the engine run forever, and let's trade that 30, 40 horsepower for another 30, 40,000 miles. So
I think I'm getting a sense from your philosophy as we get deeper into this of why your engines are lasting. I think, interestingly, back when I was very early in my tuning career, the sort of the ability for a lot of aftermarket ECUs to run the rotary engine properly was much more limited than it is now. And it wasn't uncommon for ECUs to not provide a trailing split map, and you were essentially enforced to run both the leading and trailing plugs with the same timing. And yeah, as it's been explained to me, it's essentially no different than advancing the timing overall, and therefore you start running the risk of knock, particularly if you are running leading and trailing plugs at the same time and you're also using aggressive spark advance. It's just not a good combination. So yeah, 15 degrees generally is about what I'd run as well. As you say, you can see a small gain in power and torque, but just like you, I think the gains really aren't worth pushing the boundaries there.
just to add one more thing to this EGT that we were hitting on earlier, the reason why I kind of believe in this theory that we're talking about of the absolute value type deal is there was a dyno session where I actually did not have a leading plug that was firing on my four rotor car. And this thing was at like 22 pounds of boost, making like 1,000 horsepower. And one of the rotors was reading like over 1,000 Celsius. I mean, it was maybe higher than that. It was 2,000 Fahrenheit plus. Now, that would be way past the threshold, right? According to, the absolute value, that would have warped the apex seal, and it was running completely fine. We didn't even notice it until we looked in the logs, and we thought it was just an anomaly with the sensor until I realized that the wire, the leading plug wire was, it was arcing out of the wire and it burned out the ignition pack. And so basically the reason why it was running so hot was because that rotor was only firing on the trailing, and the trailing was a 15-degree split. So if I had 12 degrees of ignition timing, then it was literally at -5 or 5 after top dead center or something like that. So that's why it was so hot. And then that proves to me, at least, that high EGT is not the death of your apex seal. It actually, if you are rich and you have high EGT, then it actually proves that your combustion chamber is probably happy. The other thing that we could bring into this is water injection. That's something I've always used on my engines. Now, I've always had to be pretty liberal with my water injection usage because I never wanted to rely on it too much for the cooling potential, although from the way it's been explained to me is that it cools the engine better than additional fuel. So like if you're going to run, 10% richer than Stoic or whatever, and you were going to do that with water instead of, fuel, it's actually more effective because of its heat evaporization properties. However, because you can't account for perfect distribution and it's not an actual injector, you don't want to lean on it. But what I'll do is I'll tune the cars until they're running crisp and reliable, and then I'll just sprinkle enough water injection in there to where I feel a little bit of misfire and power loss, and I'll pull it back just a little bit. And whatever that is what we leave it at. It makes me feel good to know there's extra water going into the engine to help displace some of the heat that may be occurring from, higher loads and higher intake temp.
Just while you're talking there, I just wanted to get some numbers. So the latent heat of vaporization of water is maybe 2.5 times greater than ethanol. I just looked at ethanol.
Wow.
There.
Okay.
So yeah, you're on point there. I think that just also really highlights, with your leading plug being out, it just really highlights that link between EGT and combustion temperature is not as set in stone and well correlated as most people would think. Right, I think maybe around an hour in now, it's probably time to jump into the 5 rotor. So I guess let's start at the start. You had the 4 rotor at this time. What was the impetus behind the 5 rotor project, and how did it kind of develop?
So my favorite thing about the four rotor engine was my inspiration was the 787B, the Mazda 24-hour car, and it sounds like a Formula One V8. Those are the only V8s that I ever had a chance to hear. That was like the last era before they went to the V6, and it's that screaming high pitch, just lovely sound. And I noticed that the four rotor really sounded like that. Of course, I love the three rotor too, and I love the sound of the six rotor. And so when I had the four rotor car, when we initially, did the project, I had this whole package that came from a company that, I thought it was going to be everything that I wanted. And when I put it in, it was a turbo engine. It just didn't sound right. It sounded like a 13B. And I noticed there's a lot of turbo or NA four rotors that just don't have quite the sound characteristics of the 787B sound. To me, that was the whole purpose, was the sound. I think there's like a visceral human experience behind having that sound when you're driving a car. I mean, I can't even describe it. It's like you can just be driving up a hill at 10% throttle on the four rotor, and it's like ecstasy just hearing the sound. I mean, it's actually more fun to drive slow and wind the gears out and hear it echo off the mountains than it is to drive fast and it's over before you start it. So that was the whole goal. And you spend tens of thousands of dollars and thousands of hours and you don't get the sound. You're like, oh shit, what was the point of all this? So I really wanted to understand that. It was frustrating because there was a bunch of hero cars to me that sounded amazing, like Brent Curran in New Zealand. His car, he had a drag car RX2 that just sounded beautiful. And so there's only like a few turbo cars that came close to that sound. And so, we ended up having to rebuild the motor, and I teamed up with these really cool guys that are in Indiana, the Richardson twins. And so that's when I really started learning. We blueprinted the crank, rebuilt the engine, took a look at, the turbocharger sizing, and, got in all the nitty gritty details. And while I'm looking at this, I'm going, I wonder why this thing didn't sound right. So I start talking to this wonderful fabricator from Birmingham. His name is Walker Morgan, big hero of mine too. He's older than me, and I always looked up to him growing up. He was way into Evos, a badass Evo fabricator. And so he's like the top guy around here, phenomenal welder. And so I'm like, dude, do you think that it could be because the manifold's not equal length? And he's like, I don't know. I don't think that that's it. I think it's because it's a turbo. It just ruins the sound. Which is kind of like debating on this, and there wasn't a lot of information. So I get in contact with this gentleman, Carlos Lopez from CLR Racing, and he's old school guru who's been around a long time, and he helped rebuild some of the motors on the Mazda Le Mans program. Like he's worked on some of those like 787 style prototype cars. And so he tells you, he's like, David, he's like, it's all to do with exhaust design and your intake design. And he points me in the direction of these Mazda SAE papers. So I start reading these papers and start learning about the collection and the merge order and all of this stuff. And I'm like, holy crap, like there's a whole thing to this. So we design out this manifold, and it's really tricky because now we have to work with the same space constraints because the intake and the location of the engine, we don't want to have to redo all that. So I go to Walker, I'm like, dude, we need this length runner, this merge order into the collector, this merge angle into the collector, like this diameter tubing. I need you to do all this and fit it all in here equal length, and it's got to be within like 0.1 inch. And he's like, are you kidding me? so he's like, all right, I don't know if this is going to work, but we'll do it, but you're going to pay for it. And I'm like, yeah, I'm going to pay for it. Let's just do it. Let's go all in. Let's just do it. And so he builds a PVC collector to make sure he can make it fit, and then he makes it all. And I can't remember what the materials were. I think we used, piping instead of tubing, like Schedule
10.
Yeah, I think it was Schedule 10. Yeah, so we get this thing together, fired up, dude, with the manifold, with the turbo off, right, just to see what it was going to sound like. And I swear to God, it sounded exactly like the 787B. It was just ripping, screaming, sounded amazing. I'm like, okay, this is it. This is the key. It's all in this exhaust design. And that car just ripped from that point on. And so then I really started diving into it and analyzing, trying to figure out, how does this sound work? Like, why does it make a difference? What's the music theory behind it? And I was able to unpack that basically there's a harmonic relationship that your ear can perceive between the sound of the crankshaft on a piston engine or the eccentric shaft in relation to the combustion firing events of either the pistons or the rotors, and that creates different harmonic relationships. So on a 4-cylinder or an 8-cylinder, it would be an octave relationship between the not necessarily like a 1-to-1. It could be like 2 octaves or whatever, but it's an octave jump. And so basically, because a rotary fires twice as many times as a piston engine per revolution, it creates twice as many pulses at the same RPM. So it's kind of synonymous to say that like a 4-rotor would be like a S2000 engine at double the RPMs. Okay. And then that's similar to what a V8 F1 engine sounds like, because on an engine like that with a flat plane style crankshaft, where the pulses are divided into 2 collectors, your ear is only hearing the half the frequency because you're hearing 1 collector of the motor. So it's basically like, yes, it's a V8 and it's kind of like double the frequency, but you're really, it's, if you were to take an and I did this, like I took 4-cylinder sound clips and I would like double them in the wave file, the frequency, and it sounds just like a 4-rotor. And then you could take a flat plane crank V8 that's at a lower RPM, double it sounds like an F1, right? So I'm like, man, maybe that's what's going on. I start looking at the sound and I'm like, okay, let me take a pitch finder and let's play with a pitch finder. So you could take a pitch finder like for a musical instrument that tells you, play A on the guitar, it's like 400 whatever hertz, 440. You take that pitch finder and you listen to the 4-rotor. I'd rev my engine up 9,000 RPMs. It's exactly like 600 hertz. And then you can backwards calculate out the math and you can figure out the relationship between the crank and the rotors. Okay. So, and that's an octave relationship.
You've really gone deep down this rabbit hole.
Yeah. So then we look at the 5-rotor that doesn't exist at the time. And we're like, okay, we got a 4-rotor and we got a 6-rotor. So what does this mean? Okay. So the 6-rotor or a 3-cylinder or a 6-cylinder or a 12-cylinder, all of these have like the same octave relationships. It's just a matter of like how high that frequency is above, how far the octave is at multiple octaves. Okay. So like a 6-cylinder engine, it's not an octave now, it's an octave plus a fifth. So a 6-cylinder, like a 2JZ or an RB, if you collect it equal length and you follow all the rules to extract the perfect, the pulses sequentially, and they're not stacking up in the collector, you're going to get a perfect fifth musical relationship. And that's what your ear really loves. And that's why some of these inline 6-cylinders sound super high pitched, right? A V6 or a V8, the sounds can change a lot because you're not necessarily like a flat plane style crank and the firings are not, equivalent like that. But in theory, if they were even firing engines and you were to collect them like 6 into 1, it would be really similar frequency to an inline 6.
Okay.
So not to get off, too far off point here, but basically the math is saying that a 5-rotor would sound like a 5-cylinder at double the RPM. And so the 5-cylinder is really similar to the V10 engines that are even firing V10s. Now, there's a lot of confusion because there's a lot of V10 engines out there that are not even firing V10s, and that's because they're really difficult to balance. So they have an odd firing geometry. They don't, meaning that in a 300 or 720 degree revolution of the crank, the pistons don't fire every 72 degrees. They like overlap one another. So like a Dodge Viper, for example, that's why it doesn't sound like a...
Really messes with the sound. Yeah.
Right. You're right. So, but there's a few key cars that do have that sound, like the Lexus LFA that, is remarkable sound quality. And so a lot of times people think, well, it's because of the Yamaha exhaust and these kind of things. Well, those are the secondary characteristics like timbre and bass and like that kind of stuff. But the true frequency and the sound and the harmonic relationship falls to that even firing geometry of the 72 degree crank angle offsets of those motors, and then having a properly collected exhaust system, and the fact that the F1 revs to like 18,000 RPMs. So in theory, a 5-rotor at 9,000 RPMs would fire so many times per revolution, and it would create 750 hertz. And if you took a pitch finder and listened to an F1 V10 on YouTube right now, and you found one that was at 18,000 RPMs, it would actually be 750 hertz is what you would hear. Although the engine's actual firing frequency would be 1,500, you're only hearing 750 because of the V. So I'm like, okay, we got to do a 5-rotor. It's going to sound like a V10 F1, and it's going to create the relationship, which would be the major third harmony. And the thing about the major third harmony is in music, that's the interval that we use for joy. So like if we're composing a piece and we want to make you feel sad, we use the minor third harmony, or we use the diminished fifth and for suspense and chaos and stuff. Like when Darth Vader's coming, that's the diminished fifth. When the saints go marching in is a major third. So it's this interval of joy, whether or not we realize it, that we use it. And all these music uses that interval for joy. And so why are we so attracted to the V10 F1 sound in the heyday, as opposed to the V8 and the V12, which both sound amazing, don't get me wrong, but that V10 has something special, and it's because of that feeling of joy that you get from it. So I'm like, okay, if we do a 5-rotor, maybe we can recreate the sound. Of course, we have this uncertainty because it hasn't been done yet, but that was the whole reason to do it. I'm like, I was willing to sell my car and put it all on the line and just put the next 4 years of uncertainty into just to see if it would sound like it does, because that's my whole jam, man, is just do it just for, for the hell of it.
Right. I'll stop you there, David. And there's a bunch of stuff, obviously, again, to unpack. I can absolutely get everything that you've been saying about the equal length runner, the order of the collector, etc., on a naturally aspirated engine. Clearly, you've proven my theory wrong, but I would have thought as soon as you introduce a turbocharger into the system, kind of all bets are off. So is the turbocharger kind of irrelevant to the sound the engine makes?
It's 100% irrelevant to the frequency and the harmonic. It only affects the secondary characteristics. So when you're talking about like a trumpet versus a French horn versus a trombone, they could all play the same noise, the same frequency, the same, high pitch, 200, 300 hertz or whatever. But the French horn's going to have a darker sound, and the trumpet's going to have a brighter sound. The cornet's going to have a warmer sound, the trombone, so to speak. So same thing with the turbo. Is the larger the turbo, the less muffling is going to occur. The turbo just seems to create a more rounded sound. Like it's not so edgy and raspy, but that's about it. But the key is that you have to do your collection before the turbo. And if you're going to use the turbo as the collector, like if everything's going to merge into that T6 flange, well, then you better be damn sure that everything is coming in perfectly and that you're collecting in the firing order of the engine. That's also key.
Well, let's actually talk a little bit about that collecting in the firing order. Maybe start for those who aren't maybe picking up the pieces, what that even means, and then how that will affect the sound.
Yeah, certainly. So I'm not really sure if it really would affect the sound because I haven't tried it otherwise, but I do know that that's the most ideal way to do it for scavenging and efficiency. And so basically, if your engine, like the 4-rotor, fires 1, 3, 2, 4, meaning that rotor 1 fires first, then rotor 3, rotor 2, rotor 4. And another misconception is that, when a 4-rotor fires all the rotors, every one fires 3 times. No, it only fires 1 rotor at a time. It takes 3 revolutions for every rotor to have fired all 3 faces. And so it's 1 pulse per rotor per revolution, whereas a piston engine is every other revolution.
I think the part that people miss with that is they see the rotor and it has 3 combustion chambers essentially. So obviously 3 per revolution. The disconnect there is, of course, that they're actually geared to the eccentric shaft and rotated a third of eccentric shaft speed, right?
Absolutely, 100%. Yeah, and that I see that misconception a lot. People are like, "Oh, it's a 5-rotor. It's 15,000, revolutions." No, it's literally firing like a 2-stroke. It's not a 2-stroke, but it fires as many times as a 2-stroke because you're getting 1 pulse per rotor per revolution. If I rotate my crankshaft, it'll go pop, 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 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then it resets. Okay, so in terms of the collection, if you had a 4-rotor, it fires 1, 3, 2, 4. So going into your collector, you want to go in a rotational pattern. So you want to go 1, 3, 2, 4 into the collector. And what that's going to ensure is that the pulses are naturally wanting to arrive one after another, and they're not going to clash into each other. It's kind of like a spiral effect going into the collector, as far as what I understand. And then there's a ideal angle that you want to use, kind of like the shallowest angle you can get away with for your space constraints, because that's going to help again with getting each pulse to come one after another smoothly. And then there's an ideal length for the exhaust runner itself. Now, this is not necessarily so important for sound unless you go way too long. So like there's an experiment that I also see, I think is a misconception, where people are talking about some guy using stepped headers to make the exhaust higher pitch. Cool YouTube video, really great content, but I don't think that affects the sound either. I can't see how a stepped header would raise the frequency of the sound. There's no way to raise the frequency. Like when you play a trumpet, the pitch is coming from the frequencies of your lips vibrating. And so in a sense, is like that's the same thing as the rotors firing or the piston. You can't create more firings than actually exist, right? So your fundamental frequency characteristic of the engine is coming from the firing events themselves. And you can't exceed that no matter what you try to do. So the idea here is to extract that maximum frequency. And anytime that those pulses are clashing with one another, then you run the risk of losing the highest potential frequency that the engine's truly generating. So you're just trying to allow the engine to speak its full, voice. And so you want to go in a rotational pattern, and then you don't want the runners to be way too long. So, there's been guys that try to do like a 12-1 on a V12 to double the frequency, but the runners, I think the problem is because they're like 90 inches long, then they're not leaving the pulses aren't making it all the way through before the next one comes to the collector.
So essentially what you would gain from collecting all 12 together in one, you're losing because of the length of the primaries is too long.
Exactly. Also, it may just be that when you try to cram all that into one collector, they just stack up. I'm not really sure, but that would be my thought, right? Okay, so then the other aspect here is that there's a relationship between your intake and your exhaust runner length. You have these different orders. So like on a trumpet, there's these different orders. So like when you're not pushing any of the buttons, you can play like a C, a G, an E, a C, like it's like these wavelengths that you bounce between. The air like physically is forced to jump through these different wavelengths. So it's kind of the same thing on a motor where you can bring out this harmonic resonance based upon the length of the exhaust manifold and the length of the runners on the intake manifold. And that's the intake manifold length based from the actual combustion chamber face of the rotor all the way to the tip of the trumpet. So the longer you make the trumpet, the longer that intake length is, considered, because that metal is actually resonating, and it has to do with the speed of sound, which is also influenced by heat and a whole sort of other things. But essentially there's this harmonic or this resonance that's happening between the intake and the exhaust. I believe it's called Helmholtz resonance. And you can target specific lengths that are within these, defined harmonic like boundaries or orders. So like for a rotary engine, maybe the exhaust you could run, I've seen people do like 44-inch runners for the exhaust system, but you could also be somewhere in the range of maybe like 12 to 24 inches. But then see, if you had an exhaust that's between 12 and 24 inches, then there's a corresponding intake runner length that needs to match with that for the power band that you're looking for. Now, this isn't going to affect the audible sound so much, but it's going to affect the performance of the engine and the power curve. And so you want to make sure that you get that right. And sometimes that's a real struggle because you have to be able to package all of that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, as soon as you have to start putting in a car, it does raise another layer of complexity. I think the other thing when you're talking about the runner length, and we see this with the 787B, that intake runner length to target that resonance and improve the engine's volumetric efficiency, it's totally dependent on what the current RPM is, which is why you see the variable length intake runners to kind of optimize the volumetric efficiency throughout the rev range that's actually being used. Let's just park the sound for a moment and come back to building a 5-rotor, because you can't just go and buy a 5-rotor from Mazda. 4-rotors have been around for kind of as long as I've been messing with cars, but what's involved in building a 5-rotor? Who do you go and see? How does this work? Particularly, I mean, we know we can stack the plates and rotor housings together. That's not the hard part, but the eccentric shaft becomes problematic.
Sure. Yeah. The most important part is that you have to have the eccentric shaft, which is the crankshaft. And that's a very complicated, difficult piece to machine. You have to have very specific tooling for that. And while there might be a lot of companies in the world that have the capability of doing it, to do it small scale just for you, they have to shut their whole machine shop down and retool. So it's really hard to find somebody that can make that. And there's only a few companies. But one of the companies that has been around for a while is Precision Engineering in New Zealand. And that's who I use to get the 5-rotor crankshaft from. So I actually started talking with him about 6-7 years before I even started the project. It would have been about 2015 when I started learning about the sound stuff. And I asked him, I was like, do you think you can do a 5-rotor? And he's like, yeah, it might be possible. Let me know when you're ready to do it. So right before I sold the car, when I was ready to make an attempt, I contacted him like, okay, let's do this thing. What's it going to take? And he said, well, The major issue would be the balancing, because when you have this odd number of 5 rotors, we don't really know what's going to happen. When you look at a piston engine like a V10, it's really difficult because you have that overlapping power pulse that's uneven, 72 degrees like that. And so, well, it's even, but kind of uneven. It's kind of hard to describe. But basically, the engine's like it's called a rocking pair order issue. So, like if you're looking at a 5-cylinder, the motor's like trying to bounce itself on the table because there's not a piston coming up that's counteracting another piston that's coming down directly in. Does that make sense? I don't really know how to explain it, but
Yeah. I mean, it's another one of those ones that's difficult to explain without the benefit of some animations or at least a picture. So it doesn't lend itself very well to a podcast format. But yeah, I think you've done the best you can. So we get that there's potentially an imbalance issue.
Yeah, so that was the scary thing was, can we do a 5-rotor? Because is there going to be a rocking order or issue? But there's not rocking pairs on a rotary engine. It's just a magical spinning Doritos. So maybe we don't have a problem here. But the issue still would be that we have to balance this thing. And we know that a 3-rotor has significantly larger counterweights than a 4-rotor and a 13B. So we can theorize that a 5-rotor is going to have probably bigger counterweights than a 6-rotor or a 4-rotor. And so he's like, all right, we got to make a dummy shaft and we have to see if that thing, so he makes a dummy shaft and uses bob weights to spin this thing up and see, what would be the ideal firing order. And at the same time that he was doing that experiment, there was another guy in Japan that was doing some experiments. And so they had 2 different firing orders they came up with, but essentially the precision firing order would require significantly more counterweight mass, but it still looked like it would be doable. And it would be the easiest way to do it, which would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so that was the crankshaft that we actually ended up having 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the counterweights are massive. So that's always been the concern. However, I don't appear to have any harmonic issues or vibration issues. And I'm also using a Billet timing support cover. It has a ball bearing inside the front cover just in case, because, you just don't want any of that centrifugal forces or whatever loading that may occur from that significantly larger counterweight trying to flex that crankshaft. That's the biggest concern with the long engine like this with that much mass rotating. So that would be your downside as compared to a 6-rotor or a 4-rotor would be that additional mass. So that's the most important thing is that crank. That's what you start with.
So essentially, once you have an eccentric shaft, is it any more complicated to build a 5-rotor than a 2-rotor, other than the hit that your bank account's going to take?
Yes, of course, because now you're going to have to get your intermediate plates and your rotor housings. And so with your intermediate plates, it's going to be much more challenging to try to do a side port, especially if you're working with plates that are factory plates. And you have to modify these plates with stationary gears that have to be put into the plates, which are basically bearing supports that take the load off the eccentric shaft and, help it to perform correctly. So you can't just like stick a bunch of factory stuff together. And then you have to make sure that the engine is, centered up correctly. And this is one of the things that people have a big struggle with, because when the longer these engines get, the harder it is to make sure that they're straight, because the error over the stack
Gets multiplied.
Right? So when you're trying to stud an engine, when you have an engine that's that long, you don't want to just use factory dowels and studs. You want to go up to maybe 12.7 millimeter studs. And these things have to be really long and go all the way through the block, and you have to have super accuracy. So the best way to do this, in my opinion, was to get a billet engine made, because you can get a lot more of that accuracy with a CNC when it comes to, drilling for all of your studding and for the housing and the plates themselves. And then you could have some through studs to help put the motor together. From what I've understood is that it's more difficult to even build the engine because it's so tall. So I had a Billet Rotary store, made really good friends with Steven Cockerell over there. He's an awesome guy, and he built the engine for me, and we use a Billet Pro plates, and we actually had the plates machined to where they don't even have the side ports in them. So you don't have to worry about the epoxy, when you're blocking off the peripheral port. And then the same thing with the rotor housings. When we had the rotor housings peripheral ported, we had some special inserts put in to block off the water jackets instead of just using your traditional epoxy style stuff that can fail over time. And that also allows us to have a really accurate, center line of the engine and be able to dry stack the assembly. It's just there's a lot of tolerance concerns that you have to stick to. And then of course, like your oiling system and your intake design, your exhaust, like all this stuff has to be custom made. And so that's, it's a lot more challenging than just, a factory engine.
It's a big job. In terms of the use of the billet parts here over genuine Mazda, is it purely around this tolerance stacking problem as opposed to you didn't need the billet parts in order to handle the power? Because I think, if I remember rightly, what are you're sort of over 1,000 horsepower, but I mean, I guess when you divide that out by 5 rotors, I mean, it's not crazy, right?
No, yeah, correct. I don't think that you run the risk of cracking plates and, being at that issue with power when you're only making, 200 horsepower, 300 horsepower per rotor. So it's mainly because of the quality of the machine work, and also the fact that if you did have a problem with the engine, you could replace the inserts that are inside the billet plate. So like if you took a factory cast plate and then you had it specially modified for the stationary gear, and then you had a problem with the engine, and God forbid you had to resurface the iron, well, you're going to have all these problems because now you have to worry about renitriding it and all this stuff. And that's that stationary gear modified piece. It's not going to be easy to replace. So if you had a billet piece, you could just replace the insert, which is the wear surface, and then you can reuse the part. So I think that's one of the big things. Now, there's not a whole lot of cars that are street driving with billet plates, and there's a lot of different brands out there, but I find that this Billet Pro design seems to be really nice. I don't have any smoking or coolant temperature issues or anything. It seems to be really nice. So I think it was the way to go.
One of the things we hear debated in the piston engine world between billet and factory cast blocks is the bearing growth. Now, I'm not a rotary engine builder. I've got a reasonable understanding of what it looks like inside a rotary engine, and I'm guessing with the way the bearings are installed, that wouldn't be a problem with billet rotary parts. Am I right, or is growth still an issue?
I don't think that it would be an issue when it comes to the actual bearing itself. It has been an issue in other brands where the stationary gear actually tries to come out of or like it leaks, like the oil around the stationary gear seal or something like leaks because the plate's expanding around where the gear. But like on this specific brand, the stationary gears are like they're a interference fit where you have to heat the plate up and drop the gear in cold, and then that accounts for that thermal expansion. However, I do believe that there could be an issue with block growth for your studs, and so I think it's really important that you account for that with like how you seal up the ends of your studs, like the ARP system, making sure that your washers and the sealing mechanism and all that is perfect, because the block is going to expand and contract. And I did have some leaking from that I had to rectify some things. And they've got some new designs on the studs where basically the O-ring that seals at the back of the block in the front of the engine is actually, there's like a O-ring groove recessed into the stud to account for that kind of expansion that can occur.
What about expansion in terms of your side clearance between the rotor and the side plates?
I don't think that that's an issue.
I guess the factory rotor housings from Mazda are cast aluminium anyway, so maybe we're not talking too dissimilar to the thermal expansion coefficient. I just don't know about that.
I mean, there is one little weird thing that I'm not really sure the answer to this, but there was a gentleman who did a 4-rotor and he used a peripheral port design, and he had like a hybrid engine where he had some iron plates and then he had some billet plates in the engine as well. And I can't remember which were which. I think it was like the inner two intermediate plates were billet and the outside plates were iron. And so on the iron plates, he had to use the liquid metal to block off the porting. And on the inner plates, they were just machined completely flat. There were no side ports. Okay. And he claims that the engine like hurt itself like from thermal expansion or something, where basically the rotors were like pushing into those billet plates and wearing them out really bad on the inserts, like immediately on the dyno. Now, I don't know because I didn't build the engine and I don't really have a deep enough understanding to know for certain, but his hypothesis was that, and this is interesting, when you look at the Mazda factory engines, the 4-rotor peripheral ports themselves, when they take those blocks apart and you look at their plates, they didn't just make the plates like solid, for the intermediate plates just solid, like with the lacking of the side port. They still have like a false port to them. So like the intake port is obviously blocked off with the liquid metal, but it still has like a little bit of a divot there. So what he was suggesting is that false port has some sort of like it has like a meaning to it. Like there was a reason why the factory engineers for the race cars still had that false port profile in there. And so when we made the inserts on this engine, we made sure that they weren't just completely flat, that they actually had a CNC like false port that was of the same depth of what it would look like if you had epoxied the internal of an engine that was an iron engine, to make sure that there was a little bit of relief there for maybe the corner seal, side seal coming around, because there is no side port there in case there was something weird going on. I don't really fully understand the mechanics of it, but we just did that. And it's everything seems to be working great. I mean, we got lots of hours on the engine, and I beat the crap out of it on the dyno. So we'll see. I mean, fingers crossed. So
Yeah, it sounds like it's doing everything right. Probably a discussion around rotary engines wouldn't be complete without talking about apex seals, and I think this is an area where just everyone has their opinion. It's really difficult if you're forum surfing to get a consensus opinion on what is best. So let's hear your take on the situation.
I don't have a lot of experience with trying different seals on multiple engines. My take on it is that the stock seal is probably a really good seal for longevity because it's really hard. But the risk with the stock seal is that if you take it too far, it'll shatter and it'll wipe out your engine. It'll ruin your side plates, your rotor housings, and it'll go through your turbocharger. And so, unless you're really good with your tune and you know exactly what you're doing, then if you're going to be experimenting with higher power, higher boost in racing, especially if you're going to spend a lot of money on a 3-rotor or 4-rotor, then it's probably best to use an aftermarket apex seal. And a lot of times these get criticized for being banana seals or warping because they're softer. But the thing is, if you go too far and you hurt the engine, generally all that happens is you lose compression because you warp the seal, and you can just take it apart and put new seals in it and put it back together, maybe scrub the rotor housings down a bit, and you're good to go, as opposed to having a catastrophic failure. Whereas the end all be all would be to have ceramic apex seals, which are going to be just like the stock seals in that they're going to last longer, but they're going to last way longer and have way less wear on the engine. However, again, those can also be dangerous in a turbocharged application if you're not, right on top of the game and you make a mistake. So given the fact that there's always the potential for fuel starvation, going around a corner, or some kind of failure in your fuel pump, and having a lean event that, maybe the engine can't catch quick enough with the fail safes, I think that I'm always in support of using an apex seal that is quote unquote the banana seal, and just be extremely conservative to not get them so hot to bend them. And that's kind of my theory on it. I don't think there's any given brand. I think they're all good. I used Goopy apex seals on the 4-rotor. I'm using E&J apex seals on this car. And, I hear a bunch of stories between all these different brands, but there's no like consistency between these stories. So
yeah, and that I think is probably the issue that I come across. So I think how I kind of see the aftermarket apex seals with the banana problem that you mentioned. I mean, it's obviously a pain in the ass. You've got to pull the engine apart and fit new apex seals, but it's much cheaper than replacing your rotor housings, your rotor, your turbocharger, basically everything in the path of destruction. So I think, that's kind of it's kind of a no-brainer. I have never ever had experience myself with ceramic apex seals, but my take on that had always been, from what I've read and what I've heard from other rotary engine builders, is stay away from those in a turbocharged engine, which kind of matches what you've just told us. In terms of some of the aftermarket apex seals, I guess some of the horror stories I hear about is wear rates. They can be very abrasive sometimes to the rotor housing. So, your apex seal is not going to break, but you pull the engine apart after 1,000 miles of use, and the rotor housings are pretty much trash. Have you seen that, or not in your experience?
I have not seen that, but I don't daily drive my car, so I haven't put that many miles on them to notice that kind of issue. But like the first iteration of the 4-rotor, I had quite a bit of miles on that and tore it down, and the rotor housings weren't damaged at all. It was just, issues with the engine that were unrelated to the apex seals. So I've never really seen that issue, but I also premix the engine pretty heavily. I mean, I run closer to 2 ounces per gallon of premix. And I think the quality of premix that you use, especially for alcohol, if you're going to use ethanol, I think that's where you're really going to chew up your apex seals, is if you don't have an oil that is made to suspend in alcohol properly. If it falls out of the suspension, then you're going to have issues. So
That's a good point. In terms of the premix ratio, because again, this is everyone you ask about premix ratios has their own kind of take on what's right. How I see it is, sure, okay, we add more premix, and that's going to be beneficial for keeping everything lubricated and in good running order. But also, this is being mixed, as its name would suggest, with the fuel. So we're also combusting oil, which in general will degrade the octane of the combustion charge, hence putting us potentially closer to knock. Is this a real concern, or is more simply better when it comes to premix? Oh, I mean, obviously there's a limit to that.
Yeah, I think more is simply better. I don't think that we're dealing with such ratios like a two-stroke engine where you're actually going to notice that much of a difference in your knock limit, like the dilution of the amount of fuel with oil to the engine. I've never really noticed such a thing. I mean, maybe you need to run it slightly richer if you're going to mix it 3 ounces per gallon, but somewhere around 1.5 to 2 ounces per gallon. And maybe if you're going to go to the track, you go a little heavier. I think the most important thing, though, that's often underlooked is to make sure that you have enough fuel in on deceleration. A lot of guys that do not have an oil metering pump will warp their apex seals without realizing it when they go to the racetrack. And I'm talking circuit track racing, because all the deceleration on a real circuit track as opposed to normal driving around. And when you're screaming back down from 9,000 rpms and you don't have enough lubrication because you're doing a fuel cut, I think that's where you can run into some trouble too. So I think just mix them heavy and it'll smoke on the warm up, and then once you get them up to oil temp, the smoke usually goes away.
I'm glad that you raised the overrun fuel cut, because you're absolutely right. It's another real easy one to overlook if you're coming from the piston tuning world. But most serious rotary engine builds are going to ditch the oil metering pump and move to premix, and then you sort of have to join the dots that, hey, if I'm not injecting fuel, I've got no lubrication inside of that engine. So yeah, pretty important to keep it fairly healthy on overrun, I believe.
Yeah. Also, just ensuring that you have really good fuel pressure. I mean, a lot of times people look at their fuel pressure and like, yeah, it's good, but you need to make sure it's good in boost. When all the amperage is being drawn from your alternator and your fuel system. I think that's probably the number one contributor to failures on 13Bs. 13Bs, you don't really have to worry too much about the oil system because it's pretty robust from the factory for what it is. I think the biggest attention needs to be to the fuel system setup. And I see a lot of people run surge tanks, and a lot of times on these surge tank setups, they're great except for long duration use, because when you're driving the car for a long time, you'll actually get cavitation from the amount of heat returning to the surge. So I think it's really important that you manage your return flow. If you're running a small like surge tank type deal, even on any system, I think you should manage your return flow and potentially pulse width modulate your pump, something like that. What I do on my cars is, because it's a rotary and there's so much money invested, I use a mechanical fuel pump that's cable driven off the back of the oil pump. And so that ensures that I'm always going to have fuel pressure. And then it also doubles as a fail safe, because if the cable breaks, well, then the engine dies. Right. And then also, if the belt breaks for the oil system, well, then the engine dies. Right, because it's all driven from the same circuit, the fuel and the oil. So, and that also allows you to run a really high base pressure, have really good atomization, and not have to use more stages on injectors, which limits your risk. And it also allows you to get a better tune with that higher atomization from the higher fuel pressure. So I like run a 90 psi base, which seems crazy,
Wow.
but it literally, it doesn't care. Like it there's no issues. Like there's no draw or horsepower loss or anything from that.
Well, I mean, as soon as you move to a mechanical pump, yeah, you're no longer sort of linking current draw to fuel pressure. So yeah, I totally get that. 80 plus PSI is not sort of unheard of in drag racing engines with mechanical pumps, but you genuinely see a benefit when you're on the dyno going from, let's say, 3 bar 45 PSI, which would be a typical base pressure, up to that 80 PSI.
Yep, sure, exactly. Yep.
Is there any downside though? So as we increase that base fuel pressure, one of the I wouldn't necessarily say it's a problem, but one of the aspects that we'll see with the injectors is that the injector dead time will increase. Physically, it's harder to open the injector against 80 psi of fuel pressure than it is against 45 psi, but no issues from that, as long as you've got your dead time values set correctly in the ECU.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen some variation in what the VE table looks like between the last car and this car, despite using the exact same dead times and the exact same fuel pressure and the exact same injectors. It's hard to know exactly why. Maybe it's differences in the porting and things like that. But generally, I don't worry too much about the dead times. In my opinion, that just kind of reflects what your VE table is going to look like. So maybe if you're tuning a lot of cars, then you want to be really consistent on that so that you know that your VE table is, synonymous to another car. But I just make the VE table what it needs to be to get the fuel that I'm looking for. And after that, it seems to be fine. So no issues really.
I think the dead time, I mean, I've probably gone down a bit of a rabbit hole here. So I'll pull it back from that and sort of state that the dead time, I think a lot of people probably do put maybe too much emphasis on. Yes, I think it's important. If I've got the option, I'm absolutely going to be using injectors with known dead time so I can enter all of the data correctly in the ECU. I have to also think back to when I first started tuning on one of the early Link ECUs that was available here in New Zealand. They had no dead time correction at all. It was just ignored. And I could still make the engine run and it would still tune. Yeah, you'd start getting some variation in air fuel ratio, particularly at idle, where the dead time becomes a bigger aspect, a bigger percentage of the actual overall pulse width being delivered to the injector. The part that most people ignore, though, is if you're not correctly accounting for dead time, what it will mean is your compensations that the ECU is providing over and above, those background compensations for things like intake air temperature, for manifold pressure, there's going to be an error in those corrections. So you'll start to see that creep in. And yes, you can bake in fixes for manifold pressure inside of the VE table. But if your dead time is massively off, then you will see maybe your intake air temp correction is not going to do quite what you thought it was going to do. Is it the end of the world? Absolutely not, but it does happen.
I just learned something today. I did not know that. That's really interesting.
We'll send you an invoice.
The other thing too is injector timing.
Oh yeah, actually, I wanted to jump into injector timing too. Yes, how important is that for a rotary engine?
Yeah, so I think it depends on the application, but one thing I've noticed, it doesn't really seem to make that much of a difference at higher power. Now, I don't know if that's because I'm already using up so much duty cycle that there's not as much available window to actually perceive a difference, but I do notice that on specifically these peripheral port motors, is that at low RPM and cruising, injector time can make a really big difference. Looking at the end of injection period, I find that pulling it way back from what you would expect on a side port engine, the air fuel ratios actually get a lot richer. So I actually run a very way retarded injector timing at the lower loads. It seems to make the engine more efficient on air fuel consumption of fuel, and also it seems to help with some of that like brapping and bucking sort of situation. But it's something I need to experiment more. Like if I had a load dyno, I'd love to be able to just sit there and play with it. But that is one of the benefits of having the higher fuel pressure, is because there's kind of this, like when you got an engine that's using a lot of fuel, especially like E85, and you want to be able to go back to 93, it's not so much of an issue today as it was in the older days, because the injectors, even a big injector today, can handle smaller flow rates for idle and drivability. But being able to run a really high fuel pressure on a really small injector gives you a really wide range to be able to have really good atomization at low operating load, because you got a smaller injector. So like on this fire rotor, I only have 1,000 cc injector on the primary, but I can get a lot of fuel out of that 1,000 cc. And therefore, because there's not a lot of duty cycle in it, because of the base pressure, well, now the injector timing seems to have more of an effect on, the tune than it would have otherwise on that same size injector at a smaller base pressure. And then if I had gone to a 2,600 cc injector, well, then it'd be hard to get the car to idle and drive correctly on 93 octane where you're using a less pulse rate. I hope that makes sense, what I just said. I think I'm correct. So
Yeah, I think first of all, to come back to your first point, people, I think, put too much emphasis on injector timing at high RPM, high load. And I mean, if you're running a typically sized injector and you're seeing maybe 75 to 85% maximum injector duty cycle, well, if you actually think about what that means, the injector is open for, let's say, 85% of the engine cycle. At that point, clearly moving the timing around is not going to be achieving much. It's basically open almost all of the time anyway. So the gains or changes we will see are usually always down in the idle and sort of that low RPM area where your duty cycle is so low, so you actually can move it around a little bit. I think when you kind of touched on it there, like I will move it around and look for the air-fuel ratio to move richer for a given fixed fueling pulse width. And if I'm going richer, generally that means that the engine is therefore able to use more of the fuel that's being injected. So I tend to find that at that point I am moving in the right direction. Now, David, I am going to have to cut us off here. We're running just a little long on time, so I do want to respect your time, and I feel like we're probably going to need to have a follow-up episode at some point because I've touched on about half of what I had on my list.
Oh, I'd love to. I love it. That's awesome.
But unfortunately, I also do have to get out of here. So we've got the same three questions we ask all of our guests at the end. And the first of those is, what's next in the future for you? More cars, more builds?
I would love to make Mazzei Formula supercars. That's my dream, is to make cars that people can buy that are like this, but more of a, streetable car, maybe with different options, not so aggressive and AC power steering, that kind of thing. I'd like to have my own line of cars that people can purchase, man, and have some 5-rotor symphony sounds screaming around. That's what I'd love to be able to do. We'll see where the future goes. Other than that, just experimenting. And I'm going to try to put a larger turbocharger on. We're going to upgrade the compressor wheel on this turbo and see if we can improve the torque curve. I do think that we're running out of compressor wheel based on laser speed. We could talk about that later, but that's the next experiment on the list.
Sure. I mean, I guess that's the great thing. There's always something new to try. I'm definitely here for it if you start building supercars, though.
Yeah.
Next question. Is there any advice you'd give to a younger version of yourself to help reach where you are today in your career faster?
Oh my God, that could be a 3-hour answer. But yeah, probably the most important thing would be to trust in that, those solitude moments where you're dreaming and it's constructive daydreaming, like running through different, like if I'm on an airplane or I'm in the car, instead of listening to music, just think about the fuel system that you want. Think about the ignition system that you want. Even if it's not possible and you don't have the money at the time, you can't see how it's going to work. Don't focus so much on being so outcome dependent, and focus on enjoying like the imagination, because I think that's what has always opened doors for me, is whenever I had just been focused on the present moment and, done things for the experimental aspect. Because when you identify with seeking the knowledge, then you're always winning. It doesn't matter if something breaks or something succeeds, you're still always winning because you're doing it for the information. You're doing it to learn. So like going into this 5-rotor, there was a ton of uncertainty and there was a lot of sleepless nights because I was like, I don't know if this is going to work. And I'm spending all this money and all this time. And, there's a lot of anxiety. And so to a younger person that feels that same kind of anxiety, they want to do that engine swap and they've never, done such a thing, and they're going to spend so much money. And don't worry so much about the uncertainty. Take it on with pride that you're going to load yourself down with this challenge, because you're going to learn something from that. And that's the point. And there are no failures. Anytime you fail at anything, anytime anything blows up, there's two ways to look at it. You can go, oh my God, the transmission broke. This is so terrible. Or you can look at it and say, I'm so glad I didn't get hurt, and that's the way. That's what I would have told my younger self, especially chasing girls. So I've got the greatest girlfriend in my life now. And it was because she's the greatest person on earth. She's helped me so much in this project. She's an engineer too. And I think that, that came into my life because I just got into this zone of just, working on myself and appreciating solitude instead of fearing being alone. I think that's the most important thing if you're young and you want to get into cars, is you're going to spend a lot of time alone. You're going to be grinding, and don't worry so much about what other people think, and don't chase people, chase your goals. That's it, man, right there.
And I think if you want to achieve anything great that sort of breaks the pattern of the norm, you therefore have to do things in a different way to how most people do it. So I guess that kind of sums up pretty much what you've just given us there. Our last question for today, David, if people want to follow you and see what you're up to, how they're best to do so, drop us your social media channels.
Yeah, sure. I would love if you'd like to follow me. It's Mazzei Formula, Mazzei Formula, and you can find me on Instagram and YouTube, and also on Facebook, David Zachary Mazzei. And I love answering questions. Just send me a DM, and hopefully I can see it and get back to you as soon as possible.
Amazing. And as usual, we'll put links to those accounts in the show notes. Look, David, as I mentioned, literally could have probably gone another 2 hours. I feel like I've just scratched the surface here, but amazing to get some more insight into everything you're doing, and particularly your philosophy around rotary tuning. This information is just so hard to find from people who genuinely have runs on the board. So congratulations on everything you're doing, and we look forward to seeing what comes next.
Well, thank you so much for your interest in my work. I really appreciate the shout out and the opportunity here. This is a really great platform, and I'm really happy that you're doing this, and especially all the classes and all the information that you offer. This is the best thing. That's what everybody needs. So thank you so much.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, man. Have a good one.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Tuned In, and don't forget, by using the code podcast500 at checkout, podcast listeners can get a huge $500 off our VIP package, which includes over 40 current courses, as well as a long list of courses to be released in the future. As a VIP, you'll also get lifetime access to our members-only webinars and our community forum. Lastly, we'd love it if you could leave a review or comment on your preferred podcast platform. Your feedback really helps us to reach a wider audience, which in turn allows us to continue bringing you more high-quality guests. As a thank you, each week we'll randomly select a review or comment from Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube, and send the winner a free HPA t-shirt shipped anywhere in the world. It's also a great place to ask any questions you might have too, and if your review or comment is chosen, I'll do my best to answer them directly. So this week, a huge shout out to Brandon J, who's joined us from Ireland, who has said, "This is my favorite podcast to listen to. I love the quality of the guests that you bring in, and no matter what the topic is, there's always something for me to learn." Oh, great to hear that you're enjoying the podcast, and if you get in touch with your t-shirt size and shipping details, we'll get a fresh tee shipped straight out to you. All right, that concludes our interview. And before we sign off, I just wanted to mention, for anyone who's been perhaps hiding under a rock and hasn't heard of High Performance Academy before, we are an online training school, and we specialize in teaching a range of performance automotive topics, everything from engine tuning and engine building through to wiring, car suspension and wheel alignment, data analysis, and race driver education. Now remember, you've got that coupon code. You can use podcast75 at the checkout to get $75 off the purchase of your first course. You'll find our full course list at hpacademy.com/courses. Important to mention that when you purchase a course from us, that course is yours for life as well. It never expires. You can rewatch the course as many times as you like, whenever you like. The purchase of a course will also give you 3 months of access to our gold membership. That gives you access to our private members only forum, which is the perfect place to get answers to your specific questions. You'll also get access to our regular weekly members webinars, which is where we touch on a particular topic in the performance automotive realm. We dive into that topic for about an hour. If you can watch live, you can ask questions and get answers in real time. If the time zones don't work for you, that's fine too. You're going to get access as a gold member to our previous webinar archive. We've got close to 300 hours of existing content in that archive. It is an absolute goldmine. So remember that coupon code podcast75. Check out our course list at hpacademy.com/courses.